Welcome to Commander Central, episode 107, and today we're going to be taking a look at listener Jerry's Elenda the Dusk Rose deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
And that is it. That is the entirety of Commander Central tonight. We're recording on a Sunday night, and Chris has a Game of Thrones-based prior commitment, so it's just the two of us.
Yeah. Good for him, I guess. I've never watched the show more than 2 episodes.
I have to watch the last one, but we usually wind up watching on Monday night, so I will have to avoid Twitter tomorrow and avoid any spoilers and get caught up then.
Nice.
So, how was your weekend?
Pretty good. Hung out with some friends all weekend. It was kind of crummy weather, so it wasn't
super crummy. Great. Yeah, I did yard work basically on Saturday and didn't really do anything of note at all today. My mom took my son to see Detective Pikachu, which he said was fantastic, so I still kind of want to see that, but I have not got a chance yet.
I do too. Chris, I think, tried to go yesterday. He gave us a call. He gave my buddy Austin a call while we were out having a drink, and he's like, "You want to go see Detective Pikachu?" And it was like in half an hour, and it was already sold out. So,
oh, geez.
I think they ended up seeing the new Dog's Purpose movie.
Okay. Well, then my mom came to get him, take him to the movie, and she's like, "I don't have anybody to take me to see John Wick 3. Do you want to go sometime this week to me?" And I'm like, "Sure. Seriously?" And she's like, "Yeah, I kind of have a crush on Keanu, and I like the first 2. I'm like, "All right. All right, sure." So I'm going to take my mom tonight this week to go see John Wick 3.
That is awesome.
I still have not entirely processed both her wanting to see John Wick 3 and her having a crush on Keanu Reeves. So, yeah, I will report back and let you know what her reaction to my mom's reaction to John Wick 3 was.
I mean, if she's seen the first 2,
right,
it's not like she's going in blind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was hilarious, and I'm looking forward to taking her.
Awesome.
So, if you want to find us on social media and tell us how your John Wick or Detective Pikachu experience went in the last week or two, how would you do that, Max?
You can head out and find us pretty much on all social media platforms at CMDR Central. So that covers Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and CMDRCentral.com.
That covers all of them, including Patreon.com.
Yeah, head over to Patreon.com and search CMDR Central. Check out our reward tiers, which one of them would be a Decks You Play episode like we're doing tonight.
Absolutely. And you can also find us, we have a Teespring up if you're looking to get a little bit of merch to wear and show off. And you can find us on Flipside Gaming. We are everywhere.
Yes, we are.
So we stay busy, and we appreciate any support you guys can give us in any way, shape, or form, however big, however small. The small stuff is great, too. Like, you know what? We appreciate the $1 Patreon supporters as much as we do the big ones. The little stuff makes a huge difference, too. Keeps the lights on, keeps Max wearing pants.
Yes.
It's all good. So, for those of you who do currently support us, thank you very much. It means a whole lot. And we are currently in the middle of giving away a deck to Patreon supporters. It was the deck we wound up brewing on our 100th episode. And that's going to be given away by the end of the month.
Yeah. Like Dana said, we just want to say thank you to everybody who
yes,
supports
for sure.
us on Patreon and makes their way out to Magic Fest to come play with us. So we had a lot of fun interactions with listeners and Patreon supporters at Magic Fest Madison, and a week from this episode airing, we'll be on our way to Magic Fest Kansas City.
Oh, that's true, yeah, because this will air on a Thursday, so we'll have one more Thursday, one that will air, but yeah, we'll be on our way very shortly. I'm actually really hyped for that. That's going to be a good time.
Yeah, it's going to be a great weekend.
I'm looking forward to getting away, looking forward to eating some awesome barbecue in Kansas City, hanging out with Matt and Joey from EDH Recast and whoever else we can find. It'll be a good time.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to record something when we're there. We're going to bring our mics. I don't know quite what we're going to do and if it's going to be for Commander Central or for the EDH Recast or for both. We haven't figured that out yet. Planning isn't necessarily our strong suit for these things. But we're going to record something with everybody together. So that will air at some point down the road. We'll figure that out.
Yeah.
So, Elenda the Dusk Rose. Let's talk about this deck, Max.
Okie dokie.
So why don't you read the notes we got here back from Jerry?
So, Jerry sent us his deck list. He says he plays the Elenda Vampire Tribal / Reanimation style deck. It's kind of unfocused right now as a whole, but he enjoys playing it. So, and he's big into the tribal deck scene. He says his meta is kind of all over the place. When he gets to play with friends, at someone's house or at a shop or even online. It's just kind of all over. He does not enjoy playing combo-based decks, so he tries not to include any into this deck. So there's no Blood Bond, there's no Grave Pact, Dictate Locks, anything like that. And he definitely wants to keep this on the tribal theme, and if we do need to swap out some good stuff inclusions over the tribal, we better have a good reason.
Yeah. He also said his budget is whatever, really, obviously no dual lands and things like that, but anything up to $40 or $50 is reasonable, as he plans on making the deck his main money sink after he finishes foiling out his medical bill collection, which doesn't sound like a fun foil project to me at all.
No, not at all.
And he did also put a note in here that he remembers us mentioning not liking Elenda decks. I will say this, though. We had a listener, James, who came to the shop last summer and played with us a couple different times, I think in the shop once or twice, and in Minneapolis as well, who had an Elenda deck. And that deck really, he kind of turned me around on Elenda. I think I was a little dismissive early on just because it has to die and go to your graveyard to get that trigger. So I assumed it was going to be really difficult to make work. And it is challenging, but it's not an impossible challenge. I actually wound up really enjoying the deck and seeing like the hoops you have to jump through make it interesting while not making it an impossible task. So I really have turned around on Elenda. I think it's a cool commander, and it made me look forward to teching out this deck.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree. My opinion on this commander has changed since our original Rivals of Ixalan set review, but whenever I run into one of these decks, it's really interesting because, like you said, it's a big machine to get going just to get all the value out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I want to say here before we get started, too, is this deck, for what he's trying to do, which is Reanimator, Vampire Tribal, with a Rust 75%-ish power level meta, it's got almost all the pieces I would put in this deck. Like, there's absolutely stuff you could run in this deck to make it more powerful. Absolutely, it would be better with a Mana Crypt, and it would be better with a, like Mox Diamond or like whatever. There's definite cards in here. It'd be better with a Badland or Scrublands.
Trash card.
Yeah. But as far as what he's trying to do at that power level, this deck looks almost exactly like the list I would put together building this deck. So that made it kind of tricky to tech just because it's a really good list. I want to say that to start with. And the second thing, this is a problem I've noticed with Orzhov too, but it's a problem I think that Commander as a whole has kind of dealt with recently. There's so many good cards in the game, and they make so many good cards nowadays. It's almost impossible to fit all the cards that deserve a spot in your deck into a single Magic deck. And there's kind of a rough best practices idea out there. Like, you roughly want to run 35 lands. Maybe it's going to be 34 in a super low CMC deck, or 33. Maybe it's going to be 38 in one that cares about lands, but say roughly 35. And you're going to probably want, 8 to 10 ramp sources and 8 to 10 draw sources and 8 to 10 removal, pieces and 20 creatures and whatever. Those numbers don't add up. They don't add up, or they don't add up to 100 anyway. Once you factor in all the things that you want to do in a deck, adding in some graveyard hate, adding in some protection for your creatures, adding in, the ability to grant haste or what have you, like throw in a few win conditions, there's just not enough room in a deck. And that was one of the things this deck really drove home to me as I'm looking at it is, I'm like, these are all cards for the most part I would run, but I want to add these 8 or 10 more. And I don't think many of these are worth are bad enough to remove. Like, yes, I want to add in this card, but I don't know what I would remove because the ones he's running are really good.
Yep, I totally agree. When I went through this, it was more of a, not essentially what would be better, but what might be more fun to run in this deck to keep it on the theme of the tribe and still around that 75% mark.
But that's going to be an interesting thing, I think, because they've really only been making, yes, Commander has access to every single card since the beginning of Magic. There's 20-some thousand plus cards you have access to in Commander, but it's only been in the last, 6-7 years we've had precons coming out, and I think in the last 3 or 4 years we started getting sets like Conspiracy and Battle Bond that clearly have a Commander focus. And now Modern Horizons has had a few spoilers already that look like they're cards that are clearly like Commander is being considered in those cards when they're being made. The precons have gotten better, and they've even started putting stuff in standard that clearly is like twisted towards commander as well.
You mean like Smothering Tithe?
Exactly. Right, exactly. Yeah, the perfect example. So it's only in the last several years it's ramped up even more so. Where like I bet if I looked back when, you know, I'm trying to think of what an example would be, but like the amount of cards you want to put in your commander deck, I feel like in each set right now, it's a higher amount than it would have been back when, you know, Scars of Mirrodin was coming out or something.
Yeah.
There's just so much stuff right now that's tilted towards Commander versus back when Commander wasn't a thing, and maybe a card was good for Commander, maybe not, whereas nowadays there's ones that are intentionally good for Commander. So I think it gets trickier and trickier as every set goes by. Modern Horizons is going to add a bunch more cards for us, and we've got 4 new Commander precons that are coming out in a couple months. So this is going to get harder and harder as we go, and I think this is a deck that really just drove home to me how tricky it is making these cuts. So the first thing let's look at here, Max, is the land base.
Okay.
34 lands which is a little bit on the low side maybe, although that's a 3.04 average CMC. That's really, really low. That's a really tight number for a non-CEDH deck.
Yeah.
14 basics. That's good enough for me. I'm not sure if it's good enough for Chris. He'd probably complain to me about it, but like I think 14's fine in a 2-color deck.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my 2-color decks I run minimum of 12. So this is right where I would want to be as well.
I try to stay at least 12. I think 14 is perfectly fine. So here's the thing about Blood Moon and Back to Basics. If you don't have enough basics in your deck, they are absolutely going to screw you. But there's only one Blood Moon, and there's only one Back to Basics, and there's only one Magus of the Moon, I guess. Those are the 3 big ones that people tend to run to hurt people for running greedy land bases. And people might not run them at all in your meta. Like, I mean, I see Blood Moon, but I don't see Back to Basics very much. I have seen Magus of the Moon in the shop, but like, I don't see it frequently. And the person who's running them may just not draw it anyway. And even if they do, you may just have mana free where you can float 2 mana, and when it resolves, then naturalize that Blood Moon. So it's a thing to bear in mind. I think you still want to maintain that 12 to 14 basics thing. But if no one's punishing you for running a greedy mana base, I mean, why would you not run a greedy mana base?
Yep.
Like, that's kind of what the game theory about it is. Like, if you can get away with doing that thing, you should probably do that thing until you get punished for doing it. So that's kind of slightly off field here because I think 14 is fine, but I also think that basics are important, but you can also cheat a little bit if you're not getting punished by the Back to Basics or the Blood Moons or whatever. So what do you think of the land base as it stands right now?
You know, I think it's pretty tight, knowing that we're in Orzhov. There aren't as many dual lands to play around with like there are in other color pairings.
Right. So enemy pairs by default are just missing half a dozen different cycles.
I mean, but he has everything I would be looking for. The Godless Shrine. He has the Command Tower. He has the Isolated Chapel. He has a couple come into tapped dual lands like... the
Scoured Barrens.
Yeah.
Is one. Obviously, the Temple comes into play tap, but it does give you a scry. That's probably worth the offset.
Yeah.
There is a Cavern of Souls even.
Yeah.
It looks, 99% of what I would run for lands for the most part. Are there any that jump out at you that you would take out or replace?
He has a Scavenger Grounds down in his maybe board.
Yep.
I think I would just take out the Forsaken Sanctuary, which is just, it comes into play tapped, and it's a guild gate essentially.
Yeah.
I would just take that out for the Scavenger Grounds because you're already running 14 basics. I don't think Scavenger Grounds is going to offset that much, taking out a come into play tap duel.
And it's a 2-color deck, and it's probably never going to hurt you running it. And you don't need to use it regularly, but there's going to be that time when somebody casts Rise of the Dark Realms or casts a Living End, and you have 2 creatures in your graveyard and they have 14, and you're just going to want to save yourself with it. I think there's just almost no downside, particularly in a 2-color deck, and there's a pretty decent upside to it.
Yep.
So I would replace, I agree, Forsaken Sanctuary or Scoured Barrens would be the 2 I would replace, and that would be one I would definitely bump up from the maybe board for sure.
Yep. The only other thing that he's really missing is Cabal Coffers. There is an Urborg in the deck, But I mean, that's an expensive card right now. So
That is pricey. Although, I think there's an okay chance. This show will air on Thursday. It may well, by the time this airs, have already been spoiled as a modern Horizons printing. It's entirely possible.
very true.
Because it's like $50-ish right now, and that's a lot of money. If it gets reprinted, it drops to probably 20 or a little bit less, which is much more affordable, although it's still not nothing. But yeah, I think a two-color deck can definitely afford a Cabal Coffers. Urborg makes it way easier. There's 7 basic swamps and a few other lands that have the swamp subtype. That helps. So you could run a Cabal Coffers for sure. The one other land I don't love that you mentioned that was in here is Evolving Wilds.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think there's any point to running it in a 2-color deck. If you want the fixing on a land, Ash Barrens does the same thing but better. You go get the land you want, but you don't need to use the cycling on Ash Barrens. You can just play it if you want to as an untapped colorless land. So if you draw Evolving Wilds on turn 10, and it's your only land in hand, it's just going to come into play tap no matter what. Whereas if you draw an Ash Barrens, you can just play it and run it as a colorless source and use it that turn. And if you don't feel the need to crack it because your fixing is already perfect, then you just don't crack it and everything's great. So at the very least, that's one I would replace. I'd change Evolving Wilds to Ash Barrens.
Yeah, I actually was thinking putting Exotic Orchard in instead of Evolving Wilds.
That would probably be fine too. I just think, I think a basic is better than Evolving Wilds.
Yeah.
In a 2-color deck, I'd rather run a basic than Evolving Wilds.
Right.
The one other land I was considering here is Phyrexian Tower. It's down to $9 for the UMA version. I just looked it up. And you could also pretty easily swap out one of those ETB tap lands like Scoured Barrens or Wilds or Forsaken Sanctuary or whatever with that tower. And it just gives you one more way to, if you need to sack Elenda, you can sack Elenda. There's enough tokens in here. You can use it as a way to ramp, sack a token, get the 2 mana, whatever. I like Phyrexian Tower, the utility on it in a land slot. There's just no downside to it. And for $9, that's not nothing, but it was 35 or 40 before it got reprinted, so I would be looking at adding that to this deck too.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
All right. How about the creatures? Usually we tend to kind of do the creatures last, but it's a Vampire Tribal deck. There's 25 of them. It's right here, so I think we should look at the creature base right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of creatures in this deck.
25, but it's going to win via combat damage, so I get it. If that's what your plan to win this game is for the most part. There's probably going to be some chip damage incidentally off Blood Artist or Malakir Blood Witch. But by and large, this is going to win swinging in the red zone.
Correct.
I like the creature base too. It's actually really efficient. Sometimes you see these decks, particularly the tribal decks, where people are trying to run those big 7 and 8 mana haymakers and they have too many of them here. It's a pretty low curve, tight collection of vampires here.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's really tight. It's low to the ground. I think in the notes on the deck list, it said that this actually used to be an Edgar Markov deck, and then
that makes complete sense.
And he wanted to keep his friend, so he changed it.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Because the only non-vampires here, there's Elvish Norn, Grand Cenobite. I guess Metallic Mimic technically does vampire stuff, so it's close enough, and Plague Crafter. But the rest, I believe, are all vampires. I don't know what I would pull. There's a couple I think that aren't as good as the rest. But I will say there's a couple I would add for sure. I think based on what I've seen lately, there's a lot of Planeswalkers out there showing up in decks. And I think there's just not much downside to running Vampire Hexmage. Having the option to sack it and just kill a Planeswalker is really, really useful, and there's no real downside to having that in your deck. And looking at, there's a couple of cards for replacements, like Bloodthrone Vampire costs the same. It's 2 mana as well. You can sacrifice a creature and give it +2/+2. And I'm sure on occasion there's a situation where you've made, a dozen tokens with Elenda and the person has no blockers because there's no way to give it evasion. You can just maybe swing through and dome somebody by sacrificing your entire board. And I guess it does give you a sack outlet for Elenda as well. But I just don't know if it's going to do enough stuff frequently enough. Same thing kind of with Martyr of Dusk. When it dies, it makes a 1/1 white vampire creature token. And if you can reanimate that a bunch of times with something like Gift of Immortality, that's probably pretty good. But there's also going to be a ton of games where it's just a kind of a bad chump blocker that then makes one more chump blocker. I think the ability to drop a Vampire Hexmage and have it be a vampire that gets buffed, and if you need to, just sack it to kill that Teferi. I think that's going to make a difference in a game more often than what the Martyr of Dusk is going to do for your lineup.
Yeah. Some of the creatures I thought about removing was Asylum Visitor. It's a 3/1, and then at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, you draw a card and lose a life. So it's a really wonky Phyrexian arena, essentially.
Yep.
I just don't see, again, it might be a meta call, but I don't see a lot of points in a game where people are going to be hellbent.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if you're playing like a particular deck, like I get it if you're playing one of those, like a bolus discard deck or something.
Right.
Where you're going to force people to be hellbent. But if you're just hoping people have no cards in hand, I agree, 100% agree. I just don't think it gets there enough. It's 3/1 for 2 mana. That's kind of nice. And that was, I think, that feels like a card that was left over from Edgar, where having a 3/1 that's aggressively costed was worthwhile. But I don't think maybe in this deck that is worth it either. I would consider that as a Hexmage replacement maybe.
Yeah. The other one I thought could come out would be Dusk Legion Zealot. It's just a 1/1 for 2, but when it ETBs, you draw a card and lose a life. I think that's really slow when there are better vampires like Hexmage or a few others on my list that would just be better with the type of strategy this deck is going.
Yeah, and I would guess the logic there is it's the kind of creature where you can throw Gift of Immortality on it and then just sack it to something every turn and draw a card repeatedly. But that's requiring you to have both those pieces out, and it's got no way to protect itself from somebody just pathing it, the second it comes out. Again, occasionally that's going to work out amazingly well, but I would guess, 19 out of 20 times it's just a bad 1/1.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I did say before was I like this as a real low-to-the-ground deck. There's not a lot of huge creatures. It's fast, tight, it's efficient. However, if he wanted to get outside his curve a little bit here, the one creature I would maybe recommend is Necropolis Reagent. It's a vampire. It's 3 and 3 black, so that's a good amount of mana. But it is a 6/5, and it has evasion. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you put that many +1 counters on it. So it stacks really, really nicely with what Elenda's already doing, because those +1 counters on her buff, create that many more vampires when she dies. And it itself does need to do the damage. So if you're in a situation where you have like 3 or 4 vampires out that have some form of evasion or somebody's open, you can drop the Regent and just swing through, and those vampires are going to get those extra counters even if the Regent itself isn't swinging.
Right.
And if the Regent does swing on the next turn, if no one is able to respond to it and you get a swing through, then it becomes a 12, and then a 24, and then it just gets disgusting from there. It's tough to cast. I'm not going to say it's not, but this is a two-color deck. You can probably afford to play those 3 black mana. And it wins games. Like I've won more than one game in more than one deck that was running Necropolis Regent. I think that's one of those cards that might be worth blowing up your curve a little bit for, because I think it can just turn around games.
Yep, totally agree.
I don't know what I would suggest removing for it, because I think any of this high curve stuff, the few things that are close to high curve, which is basically what Elish Norn and Champion of Dusk at 5 mana and Blood Witch at 5 are all 3 good cards in the deck, so I don't know what I would pull for it. But it's one I would consider, or at least maybe do a test try on, because I think he would be very happy with Necropolis Reagent.
Yeah, for sure. Some of the other ones I kind of thought would be good in this deck would be Vindictive Vampire and Cruel Celebrant. They're just more Blood Artist type cards.
Gives you kind of a backup plan a little bit, particularly if you're reanimating stuff.
Yep. Falconwrath Noble, another one of those aristocrat cards.
Mm-hmm.
But my 2 high-end for the curve that I found that would be cool in this deck would be Bishop of Rebirth. So that's the Sun Titan vampire.
Oh, yeah.
Whenever it attacks, return target creature card with CMC 3 or less from your graveyard to your battlefield. Well, that brings back a lot of the creatures already in this list, but specifically it brings back Draina Liberator of Malakir.
Oh, yeah.
Which is just a powerhouse in the air. It's going to pump the entire team. Being able to recur that on every attack with that bishop is pretty nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then,
Drain is just a really, really good card in general, but it synergizes really, really well with this deck.
yes. And my final creature is Bishop of Binding, another Rivals of Ixalan card. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Bishop leaves the battlefield, so it's an O-ring effect.
Yep.
But the plus side of it is whenever Bishop of Binding attacks, target vampire gets +X until end of turn, where X is the power of the creature you exiled.
Oh, sure.
So it's another way to push the damage through, or maybe pump Elenda, and then is she only makes the dudes based off of the counters on her?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, no.
Based on her power. So like anything that buffs her works as well.
Right. So this could buff Elenda, gets through some damage, sacrifice her, make a ton of tokens.
That sounds like a good option as well. And one last creature I think you could maybe consider here, and this is maybe cheating a little bit, but hey, it's got Changeling, so technically it's a vampire, and that's a Mirror Entity. And the reason I would at least kind of consider that one, it's 3 mana, 2 and a white, but it has X until end of turn. Creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. So there's a lot of times that you drop a Mirror Entity, and again, this is kind of like Necropolis Reagent where it doesn't need to attack. Mirror Entity can use that ability the turn it comes into play. So even if you're at, like 8 or 9 mana and you spend 3 to cast Mirror Entity, you still have 5 mana available to make all your creatures 5/5s, including any tokens off Elenda, including any of those cheap 1-drop vampires. And particularly if you add Cabal Coffers to this deck, or you just so happen to, have ramped out and you're at 14 mana or something, you're just going to kill people. Like, Mirror Entity is a win condition unto itself in a lot of decks.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's just another way to pump Elenda and just make some tokens if you have no way to get +1/+1 counters on it.
Yeah, that's another one. That's true. Like, worst case scenario, somebody board wipes and you're like, oh, okay, well, Elenda's a 6/6, but I have a Mirror Entity out and I have 7 mana free. Well, why not get 7 free tokens off the deal? So,
Right.
That's one I would strongly consider too. It's a non-vampire, but technically it is because it has Changeling, so it becomes a vampire. That's one I would take a look at as well in that deck, particularly if you're looking for win conditions. How about artifacts, or in particular ramp, since that's for the most part what artifacts are doing here?
There's not much.
6 artifacts.
6 artifacts.
Ashen's Altar, which is a sack out for Elenda, makes sense here because you have so many tokens as well. I don't know if I would consider it a ramp spell, because I would think you're not going to be playing like Asylum Visitor on turn 2 and then Altar on 3 and then like sacrificing your creatures to get something out. This isn't like an Eldrazi deck where it's worth losing 3 bodies to get Kozilek out on turn 4 or something.
Right.
I think it's a good card, but I wouldn't call it ramp. You have Nim Deathmantle, which is a great reanimation piece. Smuggler's Captor, which is technically a draw spell. I guess it's not really draw, it's more of a card quality. Arzal Signet and Soul Ring, which are ramp, and then Skull Clamp, which is draw, and fantastic at that. So 6 artifacts, but really only 2 of them are ramp, and there's not much else that ramps you in this deck. I guess Legion's Landing technically, but... So here's where we get to the point where we say, okay, the creature stuff we talked about, it's probably something you can find like creature for creature replacements if you want to upgrade a few of those. I feel like he wants more ramp, and to get more ramp in this deck, you need to start pulling out pieces elsewhere, and I don't entirely know what to tell him to pull out here.
Yeah, I struggled with this part as well. It pretty much just comes down to cutting some other spells versus creatures if you want this to be more of a creature-heavy deck, and just picking the best of the reanimation spells and picking the best tutors you're running to make some cuts for some artifacts that we might suggest.
Yeah, like, so for example, there's for tutors, we have Beseech the Queen, we have Demonic Tutor, we have Diabolic Intent. I think there's at least one more I saw in here, but I could be misremembering. And technically Entomb works as a tutor too, to put stuff into your graveyard. And it's a reanimator deck, so that's mostly one. I feel like you could probably get away with dropping Beseech the Queen. You have a ton of tutors, and none of those tutors are really... This isn't a combo deck, so you're not looking for a combo piece to just combo out and win.
Yep.
So I would be tempted to remove a tutor. And Beseech the Queen is probably the worst of the lot, I would guess. And maybe run a ramp spell there.
Yeah. So did you have any artifacts you wanted to add to this, I guess, Dana?
I don't think any, because number one, again, there's no talismans that are available here in these colors. Chromatic Lantern isn't necessarily that important in a 2-color deck. There's a couple of the 2-mana rocks I would consider Felwar Stone or Everflowing Chalice, because that scales up pretty nicely. Those would probably be the first 2 I would look to add in this deck.
Okay.
Yeah, I think those 2. That's where I would start. I also don't know if I love Smuggler's Copter.
Oh, I don't like it in this deck. I understand why it's in this deck. It's just a way to poke some damage through and rummage through your deck.
But it puts stuff in the graveyard, and it is a Reanimator deck, so maybe it does enough work there, and that's if he told me that it's worth running in the deck because of that, I would believe him. But I do think I would pull a couple things somewhere to find room for just a couple more ramp spells. There's just going to be so many times when you don't see you don't see your Soul Ring, and you don't see your Orzhov Signet in, with those being the only 2 really. I guess Legion's Landing too. With those being the only ones, you're just going to be kind of at even mana the entire game, and the green player is going to get ahead of you, and so is the player that's running 10 artifact rocks.
Yep, for sure. So I didn't go the traditional ramp like a Locket or a Clue Stone. I went with stuff that's gonna help with that life gain, life loss stuff mentality that's built into a lot of these vampires.
Okay.
So I went right to Bantu's Monument. It's a 3-mana artifact. It's gonna reduce the cost of 16 creatures in this deck if he makes no changes.
Nice.
And then whenever you cast a creature spell, not just a black creature spell,
right,
each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. That's huge when all your creatures are roughly 2 to 3 CMC.
Yeah.
Another one would be Herald's Horn. It would have been in the Edgar deck.
Yep.
It's a card draw engine because you run a lot of vampires, so you're going to be revealing that vampire, putting it into your hand, then drawing for turn. And finally, this isn't a ramp suggestion, but it might be a card draw alternative to Smuggler's Copter, would be Vanquisher's Banner. Just another build up your board and then draw some cards and you cast your vampires.
Yeah, I like both of those 2. I'm a fan of Herald's Horn as well. That's a good call. Vanquisher's Banner I like as well, but Herald's Horn being 3 mana makes that much, much easier to run and find room for.
Yeah.
So, any suggestions on what you would cut to find room for a few of these?
Okay, let's see. Smuggler's Copter.
Yeah.
Lingering Souls is in the sorcery slot.
And it's Lingering Souls is a great card, but I don't know if it synergizes with much here aside from Skull Clamp and aside from Ashdod's Altar.
Yeah, it's just an early game defense, I think, is what's happening.
Yeah.
That's why I tried running it in Regna and Krav, and it just didn't make the cut.
Sure, it just didn't do enough.
And then Beseech the Queen. Those would be my 3 for sure.
Okay.
I would cut for those artifacts. Like we've been saying, this deck is already pretty tight. It's hard to narrow it down.
Yeah. Well, so this is kind of a weird thing to say, and I guess I don't want to say remove some removal. But there's a lot of removal in this deck.
Yeah.
So for board wipes, we've got Cleansing Nova, and we have, Merciless Eviction, and so those 2. I said and, but I guess there's those 2, and that
and
is
Torment, I guess.
Torment, I guess, right. But for targeted removal, we're looking at, what do we have here? Vindicate and Anguish Unmaking, Crush Contraband, Hero's Downfall, Mortify, Swords to Plowshares, Utter End, Vraska's Contempt. I'm not going to say that's too much, but I think I will say that's great to see that much in a deck.
Yeah.
The one thing, I don't even know what to say to remove. Like, I could say pull Mortify, but it's still, because I just wrote an article on it, but like, it's not a bad card. Like, it's not like, because kind of the point of the Mortify article was like, if you're not already running these cards, run,
right,
replace them with Mortify, but he's running all those cards basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just a really solid removal package, and I just can't even, I don't want to say pull any of those out.
I guess I would maybe take out one of the targeted removal spells, whether it's Vindicate or Mortify, and put in one more sweeper.
Maybe whether it's a Wrath of God or Toxic Deluge or so. Here's one I thought about that, and here's one I would maybe consider. And again, we're blowing up his curve, which is so nice and low. And I've already suggested 1 6-mana spell, and now I'm going to suggest an 8-mana spell.
So my idea for a sweeper would be Dusk to Dawn from Amonkhet. Dusk being the top half says destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. So it's going to kill Elenda. That's great. You're going to make some tokens. The Dawn side for 5 mana with Aftermath says return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. So it's just a way to recur a lot of your creatures. In fact, it's going to recur 17 of them in the current list in the show notes back to your hand. So that's a great way to just refill your hand versus trying to draw to an answer maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be where I would maybe cut for either Mortify or Vindicate.
Yeah. Yeah, in Merciless Eviction, so, man, it's such a good card, but it does stop the Elenda triggers.
That's if he chooses creatures.
That's true, but I think then I'm just going to probably run Austere Command and have most of the same flexibility and know that if I have to pick creatures, it's going to still give me the tokens off Elenda.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point, and that makes sense. I think it
doesn't hit Planeswalkers, which Merciless Eviction does. So that's
right.
I'm not saying it's a perfect swap. I would just say you could at least consider that as a replacement for Merciless Eviction because it does give you the Elenda triggers. You know, the once in a while that's going to happen.
Yeah.
How about we take a look at some of the reanimation spells here?
Sure.
There is a handful. We have things like Dread Return. We have Necromantic Summons, Reanimate, Rise from the Grave. Unburial Rites, it just returns a card from your graveyard to the battlefield, but it has flashback. That's really, really useful. Victimize. Entomb, I guess, just puts one there, but that's quite a few really good reanimation cards, as well as things like Marshal's Anthem, which lets you bring something back and then turns into an Anthem, and Gift of Immortality, which is really ripe to be abused here.
Yeah.
Reanimation stuff is tricky, and I kind of would compare it to the problem with the fling cards in my Crash deck. You need to have a particular density of those cards to be able to consistently hit them when you need them. But once you get to that density, you can then have too many and be in a position where, like, you've got 2 or 3 in hand and really only one of them is useful at a time.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a solution for that or what. I just wanted to point that out, that those kind of things can be tricky sometimes, and finding that balance is really hard too.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying, but I think the issue specifically, and issue is the wrong word, but I think the issue with this deck and reanimation is since it's not combo enabled.
Yeah.
Like something like Entomb, I always think about Chris's Alesha deck when he just entombs something that he's going to bring back right away with Alesha. I don't think there's anything Entomb worthy that he's just going to grab right away to combo into a win or combo into an advancement in the board state.
Well, and even if you don't entomb something with Alesha to win, it's still something that the piece to reanimate it is in your command zone. So there's a really good chance that entombing something just puts it back into play that second because Alesha's in your command zone. She can be out at any time, and then it does it via swinging. If you are entombing something in this deck, you have to have drawn a reanimation piece. So I'm not saying Entomb isn't good, but I'm saying it's different here than it is in an Alesha deck where the enabler is in your command zone. Here you have to have drawn the enabler.
Yes.
So I also am not entirely sure Entomb is worth running, as cool of a card as it is, and I love Entomb. I think it's giving you more hoops to jump through than you need.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that.
But I like all those reanimation cards. I'm not going to tell you not to run them because I like them all and I get what the deck is doing, and there's probably enough times those kind of wind up being your draw spells because they're basically getting you creatures from your graveyard into play. It's the equivalent of drawing cards in terms of resources because there's not a lot of draw here. and maybe we can touch on that next. There's a few creatures with draw stuff. Twilight Prophet, Champion of Dusk are pretty reliable. You have Skull Clamp if you have any tokens out. Phyrexian Arena is great. Read the Bones just gets you 2 cards, the best 2 of 4 roughly because it's a scry effect. Is that enough, do you think, Max?
Oof. I don't know. Currently, no. I think that the deck is lacking a little bit. But, I mean, Phyrexian Arena's in here. It's hard to say. It kind of depends on how fast he wants the game to go. If he's fine drawing 1 to 2 cards a turn versus 3 to 4, maybe like something you and I are more used to doing in our decks. Something like Vanquisher's Banner or Herald's Horn is going to help a lot with the drawing stuff, though.
Yes, that'll make a difference there as well. The one card I kind of thought I might want to see here is Wretched Confluence. 5 mana, so it's instant speed. It can flex and draw you. Basically, you choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. The 3 modes are: target player draws a card and loses a life, target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So the reason I like Wretched Confluence is you can just draw 3 cards, and that's fine. You can kill 3 creatures maybe, or 1 semi-big creature with a -2/-2. You can bring back a couple of your cheap creatures and recast them very easily because there's a lot of cheap ones here. You can mix and match any combination of those things. And because of the targeted player ability and they lose 3 life, you can lightning bolt somebody to death for 5 mana. It's, kind of like Sign in Blood can be targeted. This can be targeted too. I killed somebody with Sign in Blood last week. Like it does happen frequently enough, so that's something worth noting here as well. So I think I would maybe run that. I think this is a good flexible deck for it. Because the creatures are so cheap, that return creature from their graveyard to your hand is not as good as bringing them straight into play, but it's pretty good here because you can just grab a 1 or 2 drop if you need to. So I think the flexibility on Wretched Confluence is really, really nice, and I feel like it's just like it's 1 draw spell less than I myself would like.
Yeah.
Any other cards you want to see in this deck or things you want to talk about, Max?
I don't think so. I mean, he has a little bit of a maybe board with stuff like Aetherflux Reservoir, Eily, Eternal Pilgrim, Filth, Fumigate, Martial Coup, Mimic Vat. I think all those cards are fine. I think it just, you need to eventually decide what path the deck wants to go down before you choose which ones you want to put into the deck. Like, Aetherflux Reservoir is an awesome card, but I don't think he has enough consistent life gain to be able to, Death Star someone with it.
Right. And there's a couple of semi-win con enchantments, Anointed Procession and Divine Visitation. There's times those are almost win conditions, particularly Visitation. So I like those as well. I've mentioned Legion's Landing a few times. I'm a fan of that card. This is a great deck for it because of the vampire synergy, but it does give you a little bit of ramp as well. The one enchantment that isn't here, we've talked about it a ton in the last several months. There's no Smothering Tithe.
I think it's just because the deck is so low on curve,
and there's just not a lot of room. There's a bunch of bad cards here that are easy to pull for Smothering Tithe.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, we kind of said it on our Magic Fest Madison episode, but there isn't a time where you pay for Smothering Tithe unless you absolutely have nothing else to do on that turn.
Right. It's just free ramp that everyone's giving you.
Worst case, it's going to draw a removal spell on it versus your commander.
Yeah. I feel like it's just so good. I mean, I hate doing that whole staple thing, every deck gets a Soul Ring. But man, it's so good in white, I feel like I really have a tough time not running it.
Yeah.
So, in summary, I'm a huge fan of Elenda, and this deck looks a whole lot like the deck I would build if I was assigned to build an Elenda deck. So maybe that's probably a compliment, but I guess it depends on what you think of my deck building. But I liked it a lot. And I think it was challenging. I actually kind of had a tough time finding suggestions here because of that.
Yeah, I think this deck looks like a lot of fun. I like that it's more of the vampire tribal synergy versus just the reanimation synergy with tokens, like some Elenda decks are.
Well, that also made it trickier, too, again, because you're trying to stick on the vampires. And I respect going for theme, absolutely. I dig that. But it also makes it trickier because then you're even further limited in what cuts you can make and what things you want to pull out because you're trying to stay within those boundaries.
For sure. I really wanted to put a Gary in this deck, but he's not a vampire.
Well, and there's enough really good Sorin Markovs that have some vampire synergy to make vampire tokens that would be perfectly fine here too. And I would absolutely have them in the deck if the card limit for EDH was 120. But
right.
it's they haven't changed that for me yet. So
no, they have not, and please don't.
I've had enough time shuffling my deck as it is. Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for supporting us on Patreon and sending us your deck to talk about. We do really appreciate all the support and help.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Jerry. This deck was a lot of fun, and hopefully we get to meet up and play a game sometime in the future.
Absolutely. All right, that is going to wrap up episode 107. Our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. The show is edited by Ken Peddle. You can find him on Twitter at LOAD3R. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR_Max. And you can find Chris, when he's not watching Game of Thrones series finale, at WiseSquishy1. We will be back on Monday. And until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.